Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone. Today we will talk about in the section of applied ethics about this notion of sexuality. Now when we've talked about ethics and about various philosophical way of looking at morals, their foundations, we have discovered that there are many theories and ways of decision making. Then we came out to see how do these theories get applied in day-to-day lives, how are decisions, how human beings make decisions, and consciously or not so, they are dependent upon the theories that we implicitly or explicitly assume. Today we will talk about an issue which is considered immensely moral by a large majority of people, which is the issue of sexuality. And that is why it also brings about the notions of taboo, and there are perhaps in most cultures there are do's and don'ts about sexuality which do not originate perhaps from the physicality of sexuality, but from the morality associated around sexuality. We will primarily look at, I will recommend you to go through these two essays that's recommended to have a preliminary understanding of the issues that we are talking about. Of course, this does not today's session is not limited to these articles, but these two pieces will definitely give you a very good idea about what we are talking about. Now, the first one is Vincent C. Punzo's Morality and Human Sexuality. It's a part of reflective naturalism. And the second one is Alan H. Goldman's Plain Sex, or published in Philosophy and Public Affairs in 1977. The first one, Vincent P. Punzo proposes a non-reductionist view of sexuality, and Alan Goldman proposes a reductionist view of sexuality, and you can guess it from the name when it calls it, when Goldman calls it plain sex, and Punzo of course talks about morality and human sexuality. If your institution or if you are subscribed to Gestor, you will also be able to find the second article on Gestor, and both these articles should be freely available on the internet if you search them out. So, my citations are primarily to these two articles. However, they are not limited to these two pieces. They are also an expression of my views and my understanding of the subject. Now, sexuality has been very strongly connected to morality in most cultures. Perhaps it is the single natural function surrounded and connected to most moral diktats. So, we find that we have many natural functions regarding eating, various natural functions that we perform as physical beings, and of course, all of them confront or are surrounded with behavioral restrictions from which may be termed from etiquettes to moral guidelines, but sexuality in particular, perhaps in most cultures, is the is the natural function that single natural function that confronts the most moral diktats. So, to start with, we need to analyze this notion, that what is this notion of sexuality? How we conceive this notion crucially determines our moral opinions on the issue. We shall proceed in this exercise from two perspectives, the reductionist and the non-reductionist view. Okay, now considering sexuality, laying the background there, let me say we make judgments about people, we make judgments about relationships, we make judgments about dressing, about so many things that surround sexuality. Let's start with a few examples. That what is it that makes sexuality a moral issue, and why is it that so many morals confront it, and how is it that we find various decision making and various questions surrounding this domain of sexuality? let's think of some of the sexual debates of our times. If you are coming from more conservative societies, you would find that the way men and women dress and how physically revealing it is seems to be an objectionable matter because it seems to exhibit sexual intent. If you're coming from more liberal societies, it still doesn't mean that you are away from sexuality, because then it performs, it comes around in various other forms. Say, what should be a legal stand on homosexuality, whether homosexuality is something which needs to be legislated out or which needs to be legislated in. What about this institution of marriage? Why is monogamy necessarily also tied up with fidelity? Why is sexuality with more than one partners a moral dilemma? What does the act of sexuality convey? So there are various problems on the surface that appear, but which all crucially boil down to how we conceptualize sexuality and sex. That how is it? How do we conceive, or what do we understand that sexuality entails? So let's think of more problems, and I'm sure you can come up with even more problems from your immediate environment or from a more global perspective. What kind of clothes young people should wear, what kind of time young people should spend with each other, what is the level of intimacy? Is sexuality a measure of intimacy, or does intimacy or any sexuality or any act of sex that does not promise intimacy, does it make it tabooed or something morally incorrect with it? So let's think of more examples. Let's think of does human emotive abilities connect with this physicality that we have around sexuality as human beings? How far should sexuality govern the interaction between people? So it varies in various perspectives, that what kind of clothes people should wear, what kind of intimacy people should display, what kind of intimacy people should have, what kind of intimacy people should display in public, and various other issues that surround the core area of sexuality. We find that there can be so many problems that arise around sexuality and legislations that take place accordingly. In India recently, homosexuality was decriminalized, and then again the Supreme Court made a judgment that, well, it debunking the decriminalization diktat from the lower courts. So this is again when we have legislation around this. I wish that we all lived in our own universes and where others' views did not matter to us, but we do have shared space, and that is what brings about the need for discussion on morality and ethics, because we need to develop a consensus, because we live in a shared space. So over the various lectures on ethics that we have had, one thing perhaps crucially comes out, that we need to engage in a debate to come around to as far a resolution as possible on whatever grounds we can arrive at them, because we live in a shared space, and the shared space entails absolute plurality of behavior as not permissible, not even logically permissible. Thereof, there is a need to have a streamlining of permissible versus non-permissible behavior. So now, let us come to analyzing this notion of sexuality that we talk about. We've talked about, if you look at the slide, we will see that what we've talked about right now is that sexuality is strongly connected to morality in most cultures, and we'll begin with an analysis of this notion. Now there is nothing new about it that philosophers can add, but of course when we analyze this from a distance or from a philosophical perspective, there are perhaps many of our hidden presuppositions and assumptions that are unknown to us, which do surface when we engage in this activity of explicit analysis of this notion of sex and sexuality. So, because we start with the analysis of this notion of sexuality, because this determines what kind of opinions we have on the issues. So, we shall proceed in this exercise from two perspectives, the reductionist and the non-reductionist view. Now, we will start with the reductionist view. Before that, a quick take on what is reductionism. In various contexts, we have talked about reductionism and non-reductionism, which are philosophical positions about various phenomena. So, when we talk about, as perhaps many of you would guess, that reductionism is the act of reducing one phenomena in terms of the other without loss of meaning. And non-reductionism is perhaps is granting atomicity or axiomatic foundation to one phenomena, which may be correlated with another phenomena, but which definitely cannot be understood in terms of the other phenomena without loss of meaning. So, we can an example, a classical example of reduction would be that, well, we can understand the color green as a certain wavelength, but the color green cannot be reduced to a certain wavelength, because when we talk about the wavelength, we leave out qualia or the perceptual feel of color that we have. So, for the reductionist about an issue, the reductionist would like to understand an issue in terms of another more baser and more fundamental phenomena, which will be which will completely explain the other phenomena without any loss of meaning. So, simplifying it, reducing it into building blocks, whereas the non-reductionist would claim that, well, we cannot do such a reduction without the loss of meaning. We can have a correlation. We say a non-reductionist about the mind would say that we can correlate mental phenomena to the neural or physical activities in the brain or the nervous system, but we cannot reduce mental activities to brain activities without loss of meaning. So, there may be a correlation that, yes, every time when I get angry, a certain part of my brain gets fired up, but my getting angry is not the same thing as the brain firing up or that portion of the brain firing up. Only when I get angry is something more than that portion of my brain firing up. It is that perceptual feel that cannot be understood or cannot be comprehended in terms of that particular region of the brain firing up. So, this is basically the difference between reductionism and non-reductionists. On a metaethical theory, when we talked about metaethics, we also dwelt on how values were attempted to be reduced to facts, and possibilities where values were non-reducible and definitely not reducible to facts. Say for the utilitarian, all values were reducible to anything that promotes happiness or physical or well-being of mankind, which is a more empirical and physically measurable phenomena than say holding a value as intrinsically good, because not because of its physical or perceivable consequences. So, non-reductionist about values would say that, well, certain things are valuable in themselves, and we cannot reduce them to any further domain. We cannot reduce them to facts, at least, to comprehend its meaning. So, a non-reductionist about values would say that, well, if I follow the principles of justice, it may lead to welfare of the society, but which is a fact, but welfare of society is not the fundamental reason for pursuing justice, and justice by itself perhaps has an intuitive appeal which is not limited to the welfare that it brings along, because there can be perceivable cases where or there can be imaginable cases where the welfare of the society is not brought about by following principles of justice. But again, the reductionist would on the other hand argue that, well, considering a short term view or a long term view, there can be a variation in the that values do ultimately reduce to fact. So, these are two sides of a debate, and perhaps to understand sexuality, we will start with these two perspectives on sexuality. So, now coming to the reductionist view, as you see on the slide, we talk about Goldman would be the classic case we take of sexuality in the reductionist sense. Goldman points out about the means end analysis of sexuality, which views sexuality as the means to various ends: to reproduce, to love, to communicate, to express commitment, and various other means. Now, this kind of a means and end analysis ignores granting any force to the primal desire for physicality, often referred as the animality of sex. Reductionists of various strains may or may not ignore the above ascribed ends, but are unanimous in granting the physicality component of sex as an undeniable motivation, and unapologetically so. So, what is Goldman saying over here? Well, Goldman is trying to conceptualize that what do we consider or conceptually analyze this notion of sexuality. Now, conventionally, Goldman points out that we find that sexuality and sex undergo a means end analysis. So, sex is never as an end in itself, but is a means to something. It is a means to communicate with a partner, it is a means to convey affection, it is a means to love, to communicate, to express commitment. Of course, it is a means to reproduce also. So, these seem to be the end for which sexuality is the means. Now, this kind of an means end analysis, where sexuality is seen as a means to various ends, seems to leave out or underestimate, if not leave out, the primal physical component of sexuality, that the pleasure emanating out of the act of sex is a fundamental motivation for sexuality, seems to be left out by such a means end analysis. Now, this is nothing new and this is nothing revelatory, but this is trying to analyze why do we have so many moral notions around sexuality. Now, for Goldman, this kind of and as he rightly titles his paper as Plain Sex, he says that, well, this kind of means end analysis eliminates the immediate physicality or the animality, as many would refer to, of sexuality. And this is, as seen in the last bullet on the slide, is this is what the reductionists argue against, that, well, there may be many offshoots of sexuality which could include reproduction and to love, to communicate, to express commitment, but fundamentally it is a physical act, and the pleasure emanating out of it is the fundamental undeniable motivation, and there is nothing to be apologetic about it. So, reductionists of various strains accept the effects, may or may not accept the above ascribed ends, but what they are unanimous is that granting the physicality component of sexuality as an undeniable motivation and unapologetically so. So, now let us look at the argument. What does the reductionist argue about? The reductionist argues, well, for one, conventionally all the ascribed ends to sex are taken as the rightful motivation for sex, and anything else, particularly physicality, is considered as perversion. Now, it is to be noted that, well, when it is mentioned that anything else apart from these ascribed ends is considered as a perversion. Now, 2, the reductionist objects to this conventional conceptualization, that the fundamental motivation is not only ignored in such a conceptualization, but is also wrongly wronged. So, there is this big error that is being made in conceptualizing sexuality as a means to whatever ends as ascribed in the earlier slide, at the cost of arguing out sexuality, arguing out the physicality of sexuality. Now, so what the reductionist is trying to say that sexual desire is essentially a desire for sexual contact and the pleasure emanating thereof, and ignoring this is a fundamental error in conceptualization. Now, this is a very strong reductionist argument about sexuality, that sexuality is fundamentally and ultimately physical, and the pleasure emanating out of it is the primary and fundamental and the ultimate motivation of it. Now, if you notice, the entire taboo and the moral dilemmas and diktats and the entire plethora of moral engagement around morality depends on this fundamental conceptualization that we have, that is sexuality a physical act and nothing else, or it is everything else, and by the way it is also a physical act with physical pleasure coming in. So, a more Victorian morality would offer would consider sexuality as sin, as especially when it is beyond the rules of the or established rules or custom of the social domain. Now, sex and sin go together very often. So, for the reductionist, brings back the physical element to sexuality and tries to explicate that, well, foundationally and fundamentally sexuality is physicality, and it is a physical act and desired for the pleasure that comes out from it. Now, if this is so, now imagine this answers takes a new direction, or not new direction in the sense that it has not been taken before, but this takes a different direction from established customs and moral claims about it, that ultimately is it's coming on it hinges upon the libertarian principle that as long as nobody else is harmed, it does not matter what kind of act it is, and society or governance or politics has no business in entering into an act between people. Now, for the reductionist, what are the claims that we can see that come off? That we can, what the reductionist is saying, what the reductionist is definitely not saying that sexuality is only a physical act for physical purposes, as many would perhaps uncharitably condemn the reductionist. But what the reductionist is saying, that sexuality is essentially a physical act, and you may choose it to portray the various supposed beauties of human life, of human associations, of communication, of love, of affection. You may choose it as an instrument to communicate so many things. You may choose it as an instrument for love, you may choose it as an instrument for various other supposedly higher ascribed ideals, but it nevertheless is foundationally, fundamentally sexual or physical, and that it cannot be done away with. And we need to take into account that before we put this act in and give it a moral color to this. So, the extreme reductionist could of course come and say that, well, there is no business of any value assignment or value assessment on this particular issue, that morality is that sexuality is definitely and fundamentally a sexual issue, physical issue, sorry, and thereof it doesn't at all come in the domain of morality, and what you may think or what society may propose is just a subjective value creation around sexuality. It's interesting to see how issues are intertwined together, because this I understand it also as a conflict between the two versions of liberty or freedom, as positive liberty and negative liberty. That, well, from the non-reductionist perspectives, which we will talk about later in detail, but that justifies or that tries to explain that there are values surrounding sexuality, and we must educate and guide our generations through these well-trodden paths for them to realize the full beauty of life and the association that they have together. So, the non-reductionist on the other hand would like to say, especially the one who is very firm about the moral component of sexuality, is that we need, like positive liberty, we need to get people to goad them into rules or these customs around sexuality, so that they can reach the full potential and celebrate or reach the higher ideal, which they would perhaps not ordinarily reach if negative liberty would be followed, where they would say that it is our fundamental drive, and if we are not cultured or cultivated into it, we collapse into the default mode that is in us. Let me repeat an example which I have perhaps given in one of the earlier lectures, that the positive libertarians say that, well, freedom about anything, say even about sexuality, as I give an analogy with, depends on how one is cultured to appreciate it. The classical analogy or the example that I am referring to is when I talked about classical music. So, unless one is trained in the syntax of classical music, perhaps one cannot enjoy classical music. Now, if I were following negative liberty, I would say that, well, let me play a piece of classical music versus a piece of popular music. To the untrained listener, perhaps most often it will be the popular music that would appeal rather than the classical music. Now, the negative libertarians would say that, well, the final choice is with the individual and let the individual choose. The positive libertarians on the other hand would say that, well, if we do not cultivate or we do not enlighten a listener about the nuances and the syntax or the grammar of classical music, it is simply unfair for the listener to make an informed choice between the two pieces of music played. The popular music is bound to appeal more to the untrained listener. So, positive liberty would say that we need to culture and certain or we need to train the listener, which does involve an infringement of the listener's liberty, but which ultimately makes the listener make an informed choice. So, basically many moral and philosophical issues can be understood under this great division between positive liberty and negative liberty. So, sexuality could be one for that instance, because the non-reductionists would say that to not goad people into moral customs around sexuality, we allow the default mode in us, which is essentially biological, to overrule us or to take over, and till we don't, this default mode would given negative liberty would take over, and one would perhaps not benefit from the wisdom of the ages. So, the positive libertarians on the other hand would say that we need these moral customs around sexuality or anything for that matter to let us reach the epitome of sexuality or any act for that matter. So, this is how, of course, we can understand the debate between the reductionist and the non-reductionist, between the ones who affirm positive liberty, which says that, well, to realize freedom one needs to surrender one's freedom at the beginning, to evolve, to learn, and then to realize one's freedom, whereas negative liberty would perhaps argue for freedom right at the beginning, and that the individual is rational enough to choose that to surrender his or her own freedom to reach that level. So, this essentially brings about the dilemma between these two strains of thinking, of positive liberty, negative liberty, of reductionism and non-reductionism. So, for now, when we are trying to understand reductionism or the reductionist view of sexuality, we see point number 3, that sexual desire is essentially a desire for sexual contact and the immediate pleasure emanating thereof. And ignoring this is a fundamental error in conceptualization. Let us look at some other features of, if you read the slide right now, let us look at some other features of the reductionist view of sexuality. It says, it talks about physical acts and the role, that's not a they, that's the role they play in survival. So just as hunger plays a role in nourishment. So this is contiguous with the understanding that sex as a pleasurable for evolutionary reason or for furthering species. A desire for sex is not the same as the desire for reproduction, companionship, communication, or any other psychological manifestation that it has become. Self-consciousness and technology bring in choice. Okay, we'll talk about the last issue later, but let's just take the first 3 points together. Now, there seems to be quite a popular theory or a popular belief that sex is required for reproduction and evolution of or for the transmission of species and for species to grow and propagate. And that is why this intense physical desire has been is as a part of our biological makeup. But for the reductionist here, he would perhaps not like to succumb to this argument that the physicality of sexuality is only because of reproduction, because continuing with the means end analysis, the reductionist did say that, well, these are perhaps the various ends that sexuality serves, but it is definitely not confined as the motivation for confined to these ends as the motivation for sexuality, and it could be intrinsically valuable because of the pleasure it emanates. So things like that, the popular evolutionary example, if you look at the slide, the second issue, the popular evolutionary example or evolutionary reason given for furthering species, that is evolutionary reason for sexuality is simply because in order to further species. Now, for the reductionist, if you look at the third issue, it is that desire for sex is not the same as desire for reproduction, companionship, communication, or any other psychological manifestation that it has become. Now, there are many manifestations about psychology. There are many psychological manifestations about sexuality, and that seem to become the ends for which sexuality is serves as means.